Ever wondered how trailblazing risk leaders navigate uncertainty with finesse and confidence? Uncover the surprising connections between their personal journey and professional prowess, and get ready to learn and elevate your risk management game with the Risk Masters podcast. Join host Julian Hay in collaboration with Risk.net as they delve into hidden gems of risk leadership through engaging conversations and thought-provoking insights from board directors to chief risk officers and business leaders.
Today's guest is Bruce McIndoe, founder of FiJet and one of the most recognized voices in global crisis intelligence and operational resilience. Bruce has spent decades helping global organizations anticipate and respond to disruptions that most companies only notice when they are already unfolding. His work spans crisis management, travel risk, intelligence systems, and enterprise resilience for Global 2000 organizations. Bruce now advises leaders on how organizations can move from reactive crisis management to truly predictive resilience. His perspective is unique. Having worked across hundreds of organizations, Bruce has seen exactly where the cracks tend to form. He's seen how disruption actually takes shape, the common ways information gets trapped into silos, and the recurring blind spots that lead even the most seasoned executives to overestimate their readiness. In this episode, we look at those common failure points and what they reveal about why organizations break under pressure. I'm Julien Hay, and this is Risk Masters. Welcome back. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Bruce McIndoe on the show. Bruce, welcome.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
So Bruce, you spent much of your career working across organizations. In fact, we were just talking about it just before recording. So rather than inside just one, from that vantage point, what does it reveal about organization resilience that leaders inside their own organization often miss?
I think, and what we talked about before is working across organizations. I see like immediately that managers, especially senior managers, confuse risk reporting with resilience. And risk registers, heat maps, they satisfy like the governance, checkoff list, but they do not tell you or leadership whether the organization can still achieve its objectives when things change, right? So the bigger issue is that what I call the protective discipline. So that's the whole range of cyber, physical, business continuity, environmental health, HR, regulatory, audit, legal, all of those are there to protect the company, right? So these protective disciplines usually operate in fragmented silos throughout the organization. And those silos create blind spots, gaps, and failures of imagination. We hear about that, from a long time. So I say, real resilience requires an all of organizational view around uncertainty and dependencies, coordinating that action. So when I talk to senior managers, I say that boards need to quit asking the question, what are our top risks? What are they going to do with that, right? What they should be asking, like, what can prevent us from achieving our value generating objectives? And are we structured to detect those potential changes and decide and act on them to increase that certainty? So that's, I guess, the whole realm of, I think we're going to talk a lot about today.
Yes, and I suspect the answer to your question is no, but let's go back to it.
Oh, you want a simple answer?
It's always a little bit less black and white than that, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, and I think it's going to be a good segue to the example you were giving me before we started the show on the impact of the Iran war, right? When you look across sectors and industries, where does resilience more often fail? I would say slowly, quietly, somewhere in the background, rather than a big dramatically, a big failure.
Resilience usually fails quietly in the space between functions that are not connected, and long before it fails publicly, like in an actual crisis, right? So that's where I would say, And when I say between functions, there's a long list of things like weak handoffs and unclear ownership. Who's going to make those decisions? Outdated assumptions from 3 years ago or even 3 months ago in the case of Iran, right? Again, I keep referring to the cross-functional coordination and those kinds of things. So, it's when a signal or an indicator is detected by one team and then not shared, right? So it's those things, but it also when dependencies aren't understood well, also, and this is where the kind of the business continuity teams can come in and really help, clarify that. And the other one is, and I'm a involved in this all the time, where plans are helpful, but they're not a solution, right? They're You need to build muscle memory. You need to build capabilities, right? So most failures that I see start from information and coordination failures before they become, operational or crisis failures. So that would be my scope on that issue. And it's
And
not a yes or a no.
yeah, and I think there's probably more to unpick on that. So let's drill a little bit more, right?
Uh-huh.
Many organizations still think about resilience primarily through their internal systems and controls. And you were talking about top risk and risk reporting, for example, which I will
Sure.
include in there. From
Mhm.
your experience working with global crisis and intelligence networks, how often do disruptions actually originate outside the organization fields of vision? So it's actually an external event happening on the organization.
Um, well, first off, a lot. Um, I would say, I guess this is why when you mentioned, focusing on internal controls, those are clean and easy to do, and people are comfortable with it, but they're lagging indicators, right? So I would say um, I guess they do originate outside, and they're missed not because there weren't any signals. And after action was, they always say, oh, we should have seen that coming, right? It's because they weren't looking, out far enough, horizon scanning. They weren't looking broadly across the domains or creatively enough, right? Kind of innovation and thinking about what's happening. So I would say, most organizations are better at kind of managing internal controls and scanning for future external, conditions. Then they are looking at those externals, so that they get surprised all the time because they're looking in the rearview mirror, not out the front windshield. Yeah.
Yes, and I had Michel Wucker on this show talking about
Hmm.
gray rhinos. I think it's a good example of the situation of
Yeah.
things that people know and are ignoring. Like, yes, if you attack a certain country, you might disrupt the oil supply for part of the world. Um,
Yes.
when you watch how crises actually unfold right around the world, how
Hmm.
different is that reality from how leadership teams typically imagine disruption will appear? So there is actually what you draw, and there is okay, what's happening on the ground.
How about it? It is usually very different, right? I think, leadership teams, I guess, often imagine disruption as something that's more clear, right? More discrete and linear. That it's just going to go up an escalation ladder, right? Not fall off and go up another one, right? That's not in their kind of thinking. So I think they expect, horns to blow, it's crisis time, right? No, it doesn't happen. Crisis, and well, I'd say let's start with disruption, right? Will often emerge just unevenly. It'll be popping up in different areas, right? So, and this is again why I constantly am out there in the market, helping companies reimagine how they're doing this and bridging all these silos. And I use that term all the time, right? So, you know, I guess, in the real world, I get, the important piece of this is the earlier that you look at these signals when they're ambiguous and contested and don't have people just kind of sitting back. It's that leaning forward, really discussing those early is what ultimately is going to, give you the outcome that you're looking for and get ahead of it. So that, I guess that's probably what I would say.
And that sounds very sensible and logical, right? And yet, many leaders assume that if something serious is developing, they will see it, right? It's like it's going to be frontline in front of
That's what I said.
them,
It's
right?
just gonna, like it's gonna be announce itself, right?
Yeah. Uh, from your experience and building on what you just said, what makes early warning signals so difficult for organizations to recognize or interpret? So you talked about silos, for example, but do you see anything
Sure.
else?
Yeah, and this I spent, like a lot of my time, first 14 years of my career in the intelligence community, and I was actually spent a lot of time developing indication and warning systems. So warning intelligence is all about surfacing these weak signals, right? That are weak, right? Ambiguous, contradictory, right? So you have to kind of look at different, scenarios, and they are distributed across, domains, what we call, warfighting domains, but also warfighting capabilities, air, space, ground. So it's the same in commercial world, right? One team sees a, geopolitical indicator, another supplier issue, a cyber anomaly, but no one is looking at those fragments, what we call intelligence fusion, right? They don't look and bring that and say, oh, wait a minute, that cyber is actually related to that actor, which is causing, they're not picking that up, right? So I guess, the problem is not that the signal's invisible or weak. They are out there. It's that it didn't look decision worthy and nobody elevated it and to the people where it mattered and that they can take action on. So I guess that's what I see in the warning gaps in commercial companies.
And I think just listening to you, the challenge is the fragmented signals, right, as you described them, on their own are probably not particularly meaningful. It's only
Right.
when people connect the dots, as you just outlined, that it starts giving a different storyline or picture. So how do you think people should address that? Because it's, in very large organization, you're being bombarded with signals all over the place.
Um, I guess, part of this, and I know in your list of things, you talked about culture and those kinds of things, and it's it starts with like, how are you organized and how do you look at the problem and who's involved with the problem, right? In fact, when I start with companies, I always tell them everything that I'm telling you today that I think you should be doing, you already did, and it was hugely successful. And then they look at me and like, what? And you had an existential threat, COVID. What'd you do? You put it together a team, multidisciplinary team. You gave them all access to the same cross-functional data, and you said, save the business. And then you let them execute. And you shorten that OODA loop, right? The decision cycle. They worked together. They came up with solutions. They deployed them. If they worked, they scaled them. If not, they came back, right? And you just work that through and save the business. The mistake you made is you didn't institutionalize that. And that's my thread here today, that if companies would step back and look at the environment and build these teams around the key capabilities that they need for their business, multidisciplinary teams, they're gonna be way ahead in the resilience and risk game.
And building on that, organizations also tend to believe that their crisis plans will guide them, right? When behavior will guide behavior, so and when pressure hits, right? So going beyond the fact that they should institutionalize some of this behavior on an ongoing basis, when
Right.
real disruptions occur, what tend to diverge most from what leaders expected their organization to do? So they thought it will respond and it somehow doesn't.
Right. I think that's an easy one. What usually diverges most is behavior. The documentation's there, right? But it's the behavior. And leaders, expect that these crisis plans and business continuity plans, are going to create clarity under pressure because it's all documented. But, real disruption exposes where clarity, never existed. So, I guess the important point is that, under stress, organizations do not rise to the quality or the lack of quality of their documentation, right? They fall back to the quality of coordination, relationships, decision-making habits. This is where the focus should be. And in fact, when I go into an organization, one of the first things I do when I'm talking to the various departments is I find out what's the connective tissue to the other departments. If they have a low connection coefficient, they're not going to be a resilient company. If they have a high, then they're probably on the right track. Simple metric.
And I suppose that leads us to AI, right? We can't really have a
Of
discussion
course, we have
nowadays
to talk
without
about
AI.
AI.
And so you've been working with AI in neural network, right, since the early days at NASA, and I think you worked at the department or the former Department of Defense. Today,
Yeah.
many organizations are adopting AI primarily for efficiency and to an extent for risk management. But from a resilience standpoint, do you see a risk that automation might remove some of the human judgment that traditionally catches those things early, right? Because it's ambiguous, it's not rule-based, and human can deal with this ambiguity.
So absolutely. um, if organizations use AI to drive efficiency, which is great, but unintentionally remove or automate judgment away from humans, fail. So again, these early warning signals that are what really matter now, especially in a complex world, are weak, ambiguous, they're context dependent, and they're not a clear pattern for AI, whether it's a machine learning, which is more deterministic, or whether it's LLMs where you're building models. It's just not there, right? So and AI, it can help in scanning data and identifying anomalies and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, and we've proven this in the intelligence realm, government intelligence, when you bring all that to a human brain and make that judgment and have accountability, those are mandatory. And you can't just automate that away with AI agents.
Or at least not yet.
No, we can't. We cannot. I'll tell you this: we should never automate away accountability. There should always be a final human when it matters. If it's kinetic, life safety, there needs to be human accountability, and before that should be human judgment. And I think if we fail in there, we'll fail as a society.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, by the way. So from the outside looking in, and when you go to your client, right, what cultural signals tell you whether an organization is truly resilient or simply appears to be organized?
Well, we talked a little bit about, relationships, right? I guess I would say, because I work with a lot of large companies, when I go in there, they look organized on paper. There's no question, but it's whether people feel empowered to bubble things up, right? Especially if it's bad news or things that they aren't really certain about. They don't want to create, uh, noise or get people spun up over nothing, quote unquote, right? When I see those kind of behaviors, then I know it's a problem that needs to be focused on. So, kind of a truly resilient organization, when I come in and talk, and I always start at the functions and talk with them and then work my way up because I have a better insight when I talk to senior management. when I see a truly resilient one, it's when it's safe, right, for people to raise those concerns before all the facts are in, right, and be able to have cross-functional challenges between legal or regulatory and what's happening operationally, right? So when you find out whether the culture actually supports, and why we keep talking about culture, if it actually supports resilience rather than neat documents and dashboards, that's what I focus on and really get to the heart of it.
And one aspect to that, right, is
Mm-hmm.
where do you see escalation pathways more often distort or dilute critical information before it reaches senior leadership? Because that happens a lot as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. In my mind, there's no question that information is most distorted in those middle layers, right? Where people feel a tie, right? They want to protect leadership from noise and ambiguity but they also want to protect themselves in dealing with the teams that are saying, well, yeah, I think this is really important, right? And so it's that middle layer that struggles with transforming weak signals and ambiguity up to leadership. I would say uniformly.
Yeah, I see that as well a lot in my work. But I
Mhm.
would say not necessarily, it's not bad intention, by the way. I would
No,
say it's probably the most
they're
difficult
trying to do
job.
human judgment,
Yeah, and
right?
they're also, it's probably the most difficult job in the world, right? To be in that middle trench of the sandwich. Um,
100%.
and across crises you've observed, what patterns do you see around silence, fear, overconfidence that leaders rarely acknowledge?
I guess, well, yeah, and kind of building on the other conversation here I would say the pattern that I see repeatedly is that silence and overconfidence coexist. And just when you turn it into a leadership hierarchy, leaders are overconfident, and the people that are down there with actually seeing the signals and censoring, they're like, that's silent.
Yeah.
Right? That combination is incredibly dangerous and something that actually you have to build uh, trust. You have to build, just truth leads to trust, and then build capabilities to make sure that uncertainty, doesn't get suppressed on its way up, and that there's a path for bringing that to leadership that's acknowledged and valued. I think is really the key thing.
And I think you've touched on that already, right? But after major failures, we can hear organization often saying that, the warning signs were there, right? If those signals are so visible in hindsight, why is it so difficult culturally to give someone the authority to act on them in real time?
Because and having sat through many after action reviews, right? Um, Hindsight creates this false impression of clarity, right? The people always say, "Oh, 2020 vision in hindsight," right? And so they're all like, well, yeah, we saw that, and and it led to this. So they don't actually do the hard work of saying, well, when did we see that, right? And what did we do from between when we saw it and when we actually took action, right? So that whole uh, piece of it is what really, I try to get them focused on. So, acting early involves, work, you're not going to have consensus. I guess that's probably the key thing, right? You have trying to keep everything comfortable, you're holding it down. But if I really think about it, if people can be actually, what I guess, and I put a note here that I wanted to say: authority in companies is often granted for managing known situations, not for interpreting ambiguity, right? I would say, and the reason I'm saying that statement is it's so true, right? If somebody sees, it's like a COVID, it's like, okay, that's a known situation. Let's put a team together, give them authority, right? But if somebody says, oh, there's this weak signal of something that happened in China and some people are dying in this, bio, lab and and it's like, well, they don't say, well, then let's get on this and here you have authority to put the task team together and see if it, matters. That's the difference. So, as a result, people wait and not because no one saw anything. It's just that the culture didn't make it safe for them to legitimately bring those to the forefront. And I think I mentioned to you this earlier. When in the strategy world, Peter Drucker had the saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And I say in the resilience business, culture eats resilience for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? Culture is like critical to that this, open and free environment to be able to bring these weak signals forward is what really can make a huge difference. Absolutely.
And if we build on that, why there's a connection to governance as a result and how an organization makes decision, whether it's in normal time, which usually is, I would say, non-problematic, versus in stress time, where it's usually where things start getting wrong. So many organizations build governance structures designed to manage disruption, right? And we have playbooks, crisis management, recovery plan,
Sure.
etc. Where do these structures appear robust on paper, but really struggle under real pressure, under real crisis?
Yeah, well, they tend to look robust and strong in areas when you have a charter and you have committees and you have roles and escalation paths and even decision authorities, are all in, clearly documented. And that's what gives leadership kind of that false confidence. It's like, well, we got this, right? We went through all this. We even ran an exercise, right? And and so the problem is that these structures are designed for orderly oversight and not fast-moving ambiguity. To some degree, what we've been dealing with in the last 5-6 weeks now, the lead up to and then the actual kinetic engagement, right? And it's not that it wasn't there. There was just ambiguity around, and some of it through OPSEC and PSYOPs creating ambiguity in the lead up, but everyone kind of knew that this was on heading in that direction. But even then, I saw major companies that did not take those early actions, like didn't even do like a people accounting of like who do we have in country right now, right? They could have done that weeks ahead of time, and then they're scrambling in the fog of war. So, it's like what often doesn't break down is the governance, but it's the operating speed, its ability to integrate across the functional and data silos. So, structure, as I said, may look robust because, every function has a role, every, the decision authorities, all of that. But what I see is that the mechanisms for bubbling up before you kick all of that off, it doesn't exist. It's culture, it's fragmentation of functions, it's fragmentation of data, just all sits out there with gaps and seams where all of this stuff happens and forms, right? So,
And to that effect, when you think about oversight, are there forms of oversight that unintentionally really are slowing down adaptation or suppress early warning signals and the ability to respond?
sure, and that's what I'm saying is that oversight becomes counterproductive when it prioritizes control, certainty, presentation quality over learning and adaptation and timely escalation and cultural space, right? And trust. So, if people feel like they have to have a fully supportable, validated story before they take something forward. By definition, you've just delayed all of that they built that with, right? What you want to do is you want to get into that decision cycle in a fused environment, a bridged environment, so everyone can kind of look at it to become aware earlier, right? So, and I see this even at board meetings, that teams come in there and they report what's, tidy and mature and defensible and largely what people already know, right? That are sitting there in the board or a senior executive team. They don't want to walk in there with messy ambiguity, possibilities, contested, they don't want to bring that into the room. And that's what I feel like is the biggest change that we need to see in risk and resilience, driven by culture and accepting that's what the world is. It's not clean.
And if I were to give you the opportunity to sit on a board, right? If you were sitting on a board today,
Mm-hmm.
what questions would you ask the chief risk officer to cut through that filtering and uncover the real vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I'm asked this a lot of times, right? And I can tell you there is no one question, right? What I did do one time is I said, well, I can string together one long sentence. So yeah, to me, when I do this, it's like, I guess the number one that they should be asking is like, what are the most critical business or organizational objectives we could fail to achieve in the next 1 to 2 years, right? Or I'm sorry, yeah, 1 to 2 years. What assumptions are we making about them? What residual risk treatment are we accepting but you're concerned about? What needs greater attention in your mind, right? So especially where you see weak cross-functional coordination or lack of data, right? So that if I can sit down and talk with the risk leader and the resilience leader and walk them through, tell me about those things, because then I can understand am I comfortable with the certainty that we're going to achieve that objective because you are and you're qualifying that, then yes, that's a great great question to ask. The other one, I guess, is the one that's missing, right? Because that's like, okay, instead of just what are the top risks, blah, 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 and what I just talked about, all of those pieces, I guess the one that I see, and back to the warning is, what are we most likely to be seeing too late? Because the signals are dispersed, ambiguous, or stuck inside silos, right? If they could ask that question, so all of that stuff is like what's known. Now ask the question, what's not known? What are you thinking about? What's out there that has you, just a little concerned? Give us a tidbit, tantalize us with what might be happening, right? And get both sides at. Then you're going to have the culture that's going to bring that up the ladder to the senior management, and they're open to and interested in the answer.
Well, that's a fantastic question to put at the forefront for boards and anyone working in resilience more broadly. I'd love to see the reaction of the CRO, by the way, to that question. That must be very interesting. And what we've seen, right, in a lot of crises, there is asymmetry, right? Where
Sure.
Sometimes a very small event can turn into a massive impact for a number of organizations. And one example I always love to quote here is, for example, what happened with Merckx in 2017. Although the impact for the primary organization was huge, because when the Russian attacked the Ukrainian tax authority, that had massive impact for them. The Merckx was collateral damage in there, right? And through a very small, what appeared to be a very small dropping into their environment, they lost everything.
Right.
And that's, for me, it's a perfect example of a small thing that turned into a disproportionate multi-hundred millions
impact.
impact on the other side,
Hmm.
and never mind the description from a global supply perspective. So from your
Hmm.
experience, right, which early signals of small failures tend to create really a disproportionately large consequence later?
Hmm. Um, yeah, the biggest consequences, and I think, in both literature and practical cases, are often small breakdowns, what I call it critical junctions or low visibility friction points, right? And the typical ones are delayed escalation that we've talked about, weak handoffs between units, outdated assumptions, and single dependency is all, and especially in like the space, when I worked at NASA and did space systems and reliability software for space, that failure mode effects analysis to understand like where are the dependencies and how can we shore them up and blah blah blah, right? So that's where the failures emanate from. And then, a slow gauge wire or a chip that isn't rad hard on a spaceship, one little thing nullifies the whole system, right? Because it goes down. So again, in those gaps, in those spaces is when things, you know, would break up. So they need to pay real attention to these, what I call low visibility friction points, and capture them there so that they're not going to turn into systemic failures.
And it seems to me, right, just listening to you, that one aspect here is amplification. When you think about that, um,
Mhm.
what do you think are, those uh, amplification factors or triggers that will really make a very small event much, much, much bigger as well? So interconnection
Mhm.
clearly is one, right? But that's not the only one.
Oh yeah, I mean, in our business, like one group seeing data that's different from another group, right? And so they're making decisions over here that may be counter to what they should be doing over here, and then the whole system collapses, right? You have where people are um, dealing with an issue over here, right? And that issue is throwing off other follow-on, called cascading issues, but they're not communicating that to the functions that need to know that those issues are being cascaded right into their lap, right? So it's those kinds of things that cause systems to then oscillate and fragment and fall apart. And then depending on what falls apart can impact the entire organization and take it down, or have some severe impact on ability to deliver on objectives or sustain economic viability. Just
Mm.
little things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so cascading effects is effectively.
It's, yeah, in the gaps, in those seams between functions, right, is where they
Mm.
kind of metastasize. And then if they're not managed, it's just like cancer. If you don't get at it early, it takes over, right?
Yeah.
So
And looking across organizations, so we talked about problem and framing why we're
solution.
here. So now let's talk about a bit solution, right?
Yeah.
Which resilience investments are most often delayed and or shouldn't be, or underfunded because their value is hardest to justify in good times?
Yeah, I always talk about organizations, and like, they typically will underfund the ones that they need the most, and that's adaptability and building capabilities in a cross-functional environment, right? And they don't provide visible return, which is the challenge, right? And they're not even a quantifiable return, right? It's like I could spend all of this effort building capabilities and adaptability and shared data, and if everything is BAU, business as usual, then it's like, wow, maybe we should cut costs back from that, and we don't need to do it. So that's probably the biggest one. Um, So what are those investments? So we've talked about cross-functional exercise, right? Building muscle memory and getting people to be able to work together. Horizon scanning. We don't talk about intelligence fusion in the commercial space. And it's so critical in state, local, federal to have intelligence fusion where the various functions are sharing information and people are looking at that total picture and trying to understand how somebody taking pictures on a railroad track, and that's reported in, could be that they're planning a IED or something, right? So these are often seen as overhead, and I would say in time deteriorate, right? So the other one we talked about too is the what I call the human side of resilience, right? So helping people make decisions under pressure and uncertainty, and that habit of escalation and being able to be accepted. This knowing that sharing that context between the silos matters, right? And ultimately the mental acuity and being able to handle like horrific issues, right? That come up. So all of that is, I would say, where investments fail. And I would argue that probably all of those things are the most important than plans and check boxes and compliance. That important, but if those foundational things aren't there, then they may be largely for naught. So
And if we move to the broader environment, right, and we talked a bit about geopolitical aspects earlier on the show,
Mhm.
how should large organizations treat this, geopolitical friction that we're seeing now more and more as predictable operational constraints rather than unexpected disruptions?
Mhm. Um, Organizations, if they haven't learned already, need to, that all of this friction with everything out there, right? Immigration and travel things that are happening, and freedom of movement. These are not, I would say occasional disruptions or unique. This is the environment that we will be living through for the foreseeable future, right? As spheres of influence form and they make their own rules, and now you're trying to do business with Asia versus Europe versus North America, companies, this is the operating environment. And if you don't understand that, you need to sit back and understand it and adapt your business models and how you operate and how you build resilience. The companies that I work with, the large companies, are building redundant autonomous capability in the key regions in which they operate. So if they lose one, just like the internet, they can still share and do supply and demand between the other two, including leadership, right? So instead of just everything centrally out of London or out of Oslo or out of Austin, Texas, it's distributed so that those teams can continue to operate if anything is lost. And that's the environment that we are now in, and we need to adapt.
And building on that, because you talked about like people and free movement, right? In a world
Mhm.
of remote work and distributed teams and learnings, where is the gap between a company's duty of care policy and the operational reality of protecting its workforce, where you don't really have control over what the workforce does and where it sits?
Yeah, now you're hitting a hot button on my, obviously when I came into this market out of the intelligence world in 1999 and really coined the term travel risk management, right? And it's hard to believe it's 25 years since we deployed that system. Uh, I always have to tell people that's the biggest mistake in my career. Had I had foresight, I should have come out and talked about people risk management. Because what I see today, and it breaks my heart, I go into these companies and they have travel risk management programs and they show me all the stuff and it's really cool and they're doing a great job if you book a commercial itinerary. What about the most important asset to the business, your people? What about the rest of them? What about the ones that are hopping on a train, driving a car around, right? So duty of care, and in fact, when you look at ISO 31030, it talks about the movement of people, right? The movement of assets. So whether I'm an expat or whether I'm a local salesperson running around, the neighborhood or whatever. So we've missed that, and we've got to bring it back and say there's two sides to the people asset. The risk to the person, duty of care, but there's also the risk that that person accrues to the organization. And a lot of times we talk about that as like insider risk, but it's also regulatory risk. It's I guess different kinds of risks that I can have, reputational risks, right? Look at what happens when a CEO, has a very public bad action, right? So people risk is in my mind what we should be focused on. And the thing that I'll say on my stump here is when I look at organizations, the people asset is the only asset in an organization that does not have a clear risk owner. CFO, financial, the operations, the ops, supply chain and all that stuff. People, who? It's spread over all sorts of functions, right? HR to, and this physical security, cyber, it's all over. And I guess, and I speak at like the Society for Human Resources Management, and I said, a lot of your members are the chief people officer. Seems like you should have responsibility for people risk management and coordinate all of that across all the functions. And they're like, yeah, I don't think so. So anyway, so that's a gap in pretty much every company right now.
Yeah, I've tend to push that back to the people or HR department in terms of overall coordination, not in terms of execution, because I don't think it sits with them. But
No, but again, it's not bridging the silos.
Correct.
Who has that? And it should, because they're the one bringing them in so they're vetting them, coming in, but they're not vetting them. They're working with physical and cyber and whatever. Bring that together so that it's works and you're focusing on that holistically. It would make an amazing difference in every company. So.
On that note, I'd like to bring our discussion to a close and perhaps an additional couple of questions. After decades observing how organizations respond to disruption, right? And you've already shared quite a few examples on the discussion we just had. What is the hardest truth about resilience that leaders are least willing to hear?
I often say, resilience cannot be delegated and it cannot be faked. And that's when I say, it doesn't live in a dashboard. It doesn't live in a risk list and heat map or continuity plan or a function. So it shows up, whether the organization can actually make good decisions and coordinate across functions when the conditions change. And that requires those investment trade-offs. So, I would say that's what they don't want to hear, because again, back to what we discussed about making those investments, but, the operating choices that they do make, and I do see, is they reward efficiency, short-term optimization, and ongoing investment in those things, and not building strength in information intelligence, right? Decision advantage and capabilities for these teams to work together. They're not making those investments, so they don't want to hear that.
And so if you were to give them just one advice, one thing that they should address to address those recurring themes, what change do you think would make the biggest difference for them? One.
Hopefully, if anyone has made it to this point in the conversation, they know what my answer is going to be. If they could make one fix, it would be to fix fragmentation across their organization, across the functions, and data. And in the age of AI, we have the amazing opportunity today to not bring all the data into a data lake or a huge, but now throw what we call unified knowledge fabric over the enterprise and lace all those data repositories where I can ask the question, here's a threat, who cares about it, what is it going to impact, how is it going to impact our objectives, and get that answer in minutes or seconds. That exists today, and that will be pretty amazing as companies deploy that and have those teams come together around what we call shared consciousness. So that's my risk and resilience nirvana.
Well, fingers crossed it happens, because I agree with you, the technology is there, so let's build on it. Well, with that, Bruce, thank you so much for your time and insights and wisdom today. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm sure people took a lot and will take a lot of it. So best of luck with all of your endeavor, and looking forward to have you again on this show. That was my conversation with Bruce McIndoe. What really struck me today is how differently disruption unfolds compared to how most organizations expect it to. Many leadership teams assume that if a serious threat is developing, it will eventually become obvious that there will be a moment where the organization clearly recognizes what is happening. But as Bruce has seen over decades, observing global events, it rarely works like that. Disruptions rarely arrive in a neat and recognizable form. They emerge through fragments of information and scattered signals that initially seem unrelated or distant. The real challenge is not responding once a crisis is visible, it is recognizing that something important is unfolding before the full picture exists. That gap between expectation and reality is where resilience is won or lost. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and share Riskmasters. You can find show notes and additional resources at ivtop.com. And remember, resilience is not defined by the plans organization write. It is defined by what they notice early enough to act upon. I'm Julien A, and this has been Riskmasters.
Thank you for joining us on Riskmasters today. If you're ready to master risk and unleash your full potential, here's how you can take the next steps. First, head over to julianhay.com to discover even more valuable insights from our Riskmasters. We've got a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you. Second, don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform. Stay tuned for fascinating discussions on risk management. And third, if you found today's episode valuable, please share it on social media. Help others discover the world of Riskmasters and embark on their journey of risk mastery. Remember, success favors the bold. See you on the next episode of Riskmasters.